We shall now proceed to the keynote address by our eminent guest of honor, Ambassador Sujan R. Chinoy. Ambassador Sujan R. Chinoy, who is the Director General of the Manohar Parrikar Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis, New Delhi since 2019. A career diplomat from 1981 to 2018, he held several important diplomatic assignments, including as ambassador to Japan. He is a specialist on China, East Asia, and politico-military and security issues. On deputation to the National Security Council Secretariat from 2008 to 2012, his expertise covered external and internal security issues, including the extended neighborhood of the Indo-Pacific. He has served as the Consulate General in Shanghai and Sydney and has extensively dealt with trade, investment, and economic issues. Currently, he is also the chair of the Think 20 Engagement Group for India's G20 presidency. He contributes extensively to newspapers and journals besides lecturing in India and overseas. Now, I would like to extend a hearty welcome to Ambassador Sujan R. Chinoy and request him to kindly deliver the keynote address. On the Task Force Theme 7, Towards Reformed Multilateralism, Transforming Global Institutions and Framework.
Namaskar, Professor Achyuta Samanta in absentia, Professor Sasmita Samanta in absentia, my dear friend, Ambassador Debraj Pradhan, Brigadier Patnaik. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure today to be here with you all in Bhubaneswar, and I deem it a particular honor because it is a wish that has come fulfilled after a gap of about 3 years. As Ambassador Debraj Pradhan just mentioned, we were planning to be here, I was planning to be here in my capacity as the Director General of the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analyses to have a seminar with the young students of KIIT and KIIS educational establishments, but that was not to be as a result of the pandemic. That wish was not fulfilled until today. Today I come here in my capacity primarily as the Think 20 chair for India's G20 presidency, and it is a particularly opportune moment for us to be here at this great institution in Bhubaneswar, with which I am not entirely unfamiliar. Many years ago, in 2008, I had the great pleasure and privilege of receiving Professor Achyuta Samanta in Australia. And he had come with a group of very talented children, young people, both boys and girls, tribal children at that, from KIITs and KIIS, and they were to play a series of rugby games in Australia. To play rugby in Australia is like taking coal to Newcastle. But then Indians have done this before. We adopted the game of cricket from the British, but we generally beat them at cricket. And therefore I was not surprised to see that the talented students from Bhubaneswar, from this great establishment, acquitted themselves very well in Australia. But even more than that, Professor Achyuta Samanta himself left a very deep impression on me. I was extremely touched by the passion, by the commitment with which he had devoted himself to his main cause in life, which is to serve the underprivileged, to provide education, especially to those who are marginalized or are deprived sections of society. And I think we have seen over the years how he has brought both KIIT and KIIS and many other educational institutions here now to this level of dedication and contribution to the good of society. This morning, when I was given a chance to go about the campus, again I felt deeply touched by looking at the holistic manner in which education is being provided in this place. It also reminded me of our great traditions in India, both tradition and modernity in one place. Respect for modernity, respect for science and technology, but coexisting with our civilizational ethos. And the word that came to my mind is that this is virtually and veritably a Gurukul, in which there is also deep respect for the Gurus. And the Gurus treat the Shishyas or their students like family. This is the impression that I have been given this morning, and it's a lasting impression. A while ago, the MC spoke about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. It's a very potent shloka in Sanskrit. And the presence of so many of you here, including from foreign countries, on this campus and on the numerous other campuses here, I was given to understand that you have about 1,500 foreign students. There is also gender equality. About 60% of your seats in many of these institutions are held by women and the girl child. And so that is truly Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. Ayam nijaha paroveti ganana laghu chetasam udara charitram Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. It is only the small-minded who think in terms of this is mine and this is yours. For those with a broad mind, the world is a family. And that is also the theme of India's G20 presidency. Education, which is provided in the hallowed portals of this establishment, this institution, is very important. Education is also something that should be a lifelong pursuit. Education does not end when you obtain a degree and pass out from an educational institution. This place is here only to stimulate your mind, to make you essentially a lifelong seeker. And education therefore continues throughout life. And as might perhaps be seen in the life of Professor Achyuta Samant also, this acquisition of real education makes one humble. As you go along and acquire greater knowledge and greater wisdom, you become more humble. You are ready to bow before others because you want to learn, you are a seeker. And when you are humble, you are also more likely to succeed in life. So acquisition of knowledge makes you humble. Humility enables you to succeed in life at what you are doing, no matter what you are doing. You look at the number of, avenues provided here itself, vocational training of myriad types, which equips you for the future. And when you succeed in life, you also earn money. But earning money is not an end in itself. That wealth that you create is supposed to do some good to society as well. And so I would say that this place and its leaders, your values also epitomize that wisdom that exists in our ancient culture. Vidya dhadhati vinayam, vinayadhyati patratam, patravad dhanamapnoti dhanadharma tatah sukham. It means exactly what I said in the beginning, that the acquisition of knowledge makes one humble. Humility provides avenues for success. Success also creates wealth, and wealth is to be put to the good of society. It is in that broad context that I want to share a few thoughts today with you about India's leadership of the G20. the global priorities today before us, the challenges, the opportunities, and also to share a few thoughts about why the global structure needs to change. Not just to reinvigorate itself, but to reform itself, to meet the challenges and to take advantage of the opportunities of the current era in which we find ourselves. India's G20 presidency comes at a time of great tumult. The global system, the multilateral system as we know it, which was established in 1945, built upon the ashes of the Second World War, the creation of the United Nations, the creation of the UN Security Council, all this was done alongside the treaty-based organizations, the financial institutions, multilateral development banks like the World Bank and the IMF. These were created in order to provide a structure based on the experience of the two great wars. The idea was to create an architecture for peace and security and prosperity. After all, the Charter of the United Nations speaks of protection of fundamental rights, peace and security, and progress in terms of economic growth and prosperity. And it was hoped at the end of that great and catastrophic war, in which horrendous nuclear weapons were also used, that finally a time had come to create a structure that would provide some lasting peace and security. The UN was created in 1945. Thereafter, the UN Security Council was created. And that one can say, those structures that were created in 1945 belong to a certain era. They belong to a certain context. To the victors went the spoils in 1945 in terms of the creation of the UN Security Council, its permanent membership, the exceptional privilege of having veto power. But the world did not remain in that kind of idealistic situation for too long. Before long, it descended into a Cold War. Even among the victors, there were differences surfacing very fast between the US-led Western Bloc, the Soviet Union-led Eastern Bloc, and the Cold War was in full bloom even before the 1940s ended. And we have seen how over the years this world has still remained in tumult, except that there has been no Third World War so far. The structure, one can say, has allowed the world to maintain peace and security at some times in certain geographies, but this experience has also been accompanied by war, strife, and tumult in many other parts of the world, including by proxy between great powers. We are today on the brink of yet another period of great flux, in which we find that all the known paradigms of the process of globalization stand challenge. If we look at trade, we look at technology, we look at finance, we look at the mobility of people, all that made globalization a very successful process are in fact under stress today. It is a period in which great power contestation has resurfaced. The peace that was held for all these years, for more than 7 decades, is once again being questioned. And we have seen a number of factors that have accelerated these differences and divisions at the global level. We have seen how the rise of China, particularly after its entry into the WTO in 2001 and its emergence as the world's second largest economy, its use of its economic power to militarize, to engage in unilateral activities, to challenge the existing global order, to alongside also build parallel institutions in the image of China to further its own goals and objectives, such as the AIIB, the new BRICS Development Bank, Belt and Road, etc. All this has put a great deal of stress on the global system. We have seen how China and some others too have gamed the system. For the process of globalization has not benefited everybody equally. Some have benefited more than others. There are vast segments of the global community today that have not fully benefited from the process of globalization. They are the marginalized sections of this process of globalization. And yet we have seen that between the great powers, there has been growing dissent and friction. The trade differences, for instance, between the United States of America and the People's Republic of China put a great deal of stress on everybody else. For unlike during the Cold War, when the two blocs had friction, they also threatened each other with mutually assured destruction. They had nuclear weapons confronting each other, but they didn't have much economic, scientific, and technological integration with each other. It made it easier for the two camps to remain two very different camps with their own personalities and their own followers. And those that didn't want to follow them became the non-aligned countries. Not all of them were also non-aligned at all times. Non-alignment was also, in a sense, a hedging practice followed by many countries that found it difficult to choose between two camps. It also allowed countries to be in partnership with one or the other, depending on the circumstances. Even a country like India that has chosen not to take sides, not to be a camp follower, also did not permit non-alignment to come in the way of its Kutniti, or the protection of its national interests. In 1962, when the Chinese aggressed against India, notwithstanding our non-alignment, we did cooperate with the United States of America. And in 1971, when the United States sent its battle carrier group into the Bay of Bengal, and India felt that it would have to hedge, it did not stop a non-aligned India from having collaboration, a treaty of friendship and cooperation with the Soviet Union. Non-alignment, therefore, is something that is practiced today under different names and labels. Today, we, in this fractured but not yet completely fragmented world, where there is a great deal of pressure on the rest of us, so to speak, as we contend with great power contestation, we, large countries of the global south, large populations, are following policies of what we call hedging or multi-alignment or issue-based alignment. This is because it is a very difficult world. It is not the simple Cold War era in which economic ties between the two camps were minimal. Today, we find that the United States of America and the People's Republic of China, by way of an example, have very deep economic integration. And the rest of the world has deep economic integration, not necessarily benefiting equally, but has deep economic integration with the both of them. That is what makes the task of the global south even more difficult today. But it is also a given that the world today is no longer what it was, that it is not possible in today's day and age for any one single country to have its writ felt on all issues across all geographies at all points of time. The era of a sole superpower or one or two superpowers is really over. And what has made this possible is also the march of technology. Technology, particularly technology in the digital age, in terms of artificial intelligence, and the potential for warfare in spaces that are not traditional spaces, as in land, sea, air, or space. But when we come to the fifth domain, cyber, it gives everybody a level playing field. And therefore, even powers that are not equal, which face a certain disequilibrium in their interactions with other powers, have the opportunity and the capacity to be disruptive, to bridge absolute asymmetries in national power, comprehensive national power, using asymmetrical means. That makes for a particularly complex world. And as this last decade has unfolded, we have seen not only rising friction between the United States of America and the People's Republic of China, but as I said before, there have been many accelerants to this process of division at the global level. And one of the key factors there, obviously, was the pandemic, or more particularly, the inability of the existing multilateral structures, the United Nations, the UN Security Council, affiliated bodies such as the World Health Organization, and many others, to arrive at any kind of consensus on particularly the origins of the pandemic, for instance. The politics of the pandemic became more important than providing health care to meet the challenges of the pandemic. And that has also caused greater divisions, further fractures in the global community. We have seen how, more recently again, the war in Ukraine has upended all notions of peace and security in a geography in which peace and security had been taken for granted. Europe had long believed that at the end of the Second World War, it had once and for all capitalized both on its Westphalian system of defining their nationhood, having clear-cut borders, but also having peace and tranquility, leading to the creation of the European Economic Community at first, later the EU, later a common currency. But even that, we have seen, has come under challenges in recent years. And not just because of Brexit, not just because the United Kingdom felt that it had a better future going it alone in a more difficult international environment, but more particularly because of the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine, therefore, has created unprecedented challenges for that geography as well as for many others. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, it is in this broad context that we see how major power contestation has resulted in supply chain disruptions. It has resulted in greater militarization. And I am therefore tempted to describe the current situation along 6 T factors. These are the 6 T factors that can be analyzed across all geographies today, and it will probably resonate with every geography that we are dealing with. The first is the challenge of or friction over trade. As I said before, globalization did not benefit all equally. Some gamed the system, some used quasi-capitalist systems to game the system to their advantage. China is a good example. Despite having been a member of the WTO for 15 years, from 2001 to 2016, it was not given a market economy status for a good reason. For it is not a market economy. It is a state-led market economy or state-led capitalism. In the context of a unitary, authoritarian, autocratic system, not without its successes. China is fond of saying that it is the only country in the world which is capable of providing, real economic growth in the liberal trading context, the liberal trade system that was created by the West. China believes it has actually become a champion of the liberal trading order at a time when many of the Western countries were closing their markets, friendshoring, onshoring, etc. And that is how China has claimed, the battle of the narratives also. So trade is an issue that divides the world today, and it is to be seen across geographies. The second factor is technology. The march of technology, particularly beyond the information age, in the new digital era, more particularly in the era of quantum physics, in the era of artificial intelligence, leaves only to the imagination of where we are likely to be in 5 or 10 years. What kind of challenges will we face? Will we be dealing with, master machines that will have, through deep machine learning, acquired so much knowledge and control over themselves and over others that they could possibly rule the world? Will human beings remain the intelligence behind such machines and artificial intelligence to use them to their advantage to govern the rest? So technology today is proving to be extremely, how shall we say, difficult and divisive. The third T is that of territorial disputes and differences. In all geographies we have seen, including our own, from the high Himalayas to the South China Sea, to the East China Sea, to Ukraine, we have seen that the T of territorial disputes is front and center. And it fractures, consensus building, a kind of consensus building that is required in the new era, eludes the global community because of territorial differences, unresolved disputes. In our part of the world, in the Indo-Pacific, in Asia in particular, we have seen how countries have done very well with regard to economic growth and prosperity, but not quite as well when it comes to resolving historical disputes or putting in place a security architecture. Asia has also been behind the curve in this regard. But today it appears that Asia is ahead of Europe, because Europe has given an example which nobody had thought of. Nobody had imagined that Europe will prove to be that example where we reach the conclusion that there is no security architecture in place. That was always supposed to be Asia. But Asia still needs to do a lot more work to resolve these territorial differences, to prevent them from getting out of hand. The fourth T is that of terrorism. Terrorism is also something that is no longer just an India-Pakistan problem. It is no longer just a South Asia problem. And after 9/11, the world has woken up to a very potent terrorist threat, a global terrorist threat which affects all countries across Asia, but also affects geographies in the United States, continental United States. Saw that disastrous attack in terms of the 9/11 attacks. And we have seen how Europe too is also not inured to terrorist attacks. So terrorism is the fourth T. The fifth T is that of tenets. This world today is rapidly cracking up into narratives, war for the narrative, propaganda, the use of deep fakes, the use of social media, the use of psychological warfare, supported by concocted, legal evidence and warfare, the type of three warfares that the Chinese practice. This is something that we have to live with today. And tenets is what is dividing the world. Whose narrative is better? Whose system of political, economic, social, cultural governance is superior? And this, I think, discourse has arisen because of the difficulties that the West has had in terms of proving the superiority over a longer period in a sustained manner, the superiority of the open, liberal trading order, even of democracy, because during the pandemic, the initiative was seized, at least in the initial phase, by the autocracies. An autocracy like China claimed to have handled pandemics much better, although that was short-lived, as we saw. In the second phase, the Chinese suffered the most. They went in for a zero COVID policy that prevented them from kickstarting their economy for a long time. But anyway, the narratives is something that divides the world today. China today has come up with the global, development initiative, in which it pushes for global development based on the parallel institutions that it has created. It is also pushing a narrative called the Global Security Initiative, where it is seeking in what you call broadly, acceptable terms, the fact that, the world needs a security that is indivisible, as against, absolute security for any. And it also is proposing what they call a global civilizational initiative, where it actually says things that can erode the importance of democracy. So this is a time where we find the war of narratives and tenets unfolding. The sixth T, ladies and gentlemen, is the T of trust, or the utter lack of it. And this lack of trust today is evident not only between nation states, but also increasingly in an era of global connectivity at the level of the individual, where borders become meaningless because sitting in your living rooms through your smartphones, you can connect to any community, any discourse, any ideology, any value system across the world. We find that trust is lacking both among nations and within nations. The polarization of the world today is something that we have to grapple with. It is in this context that one can say that the current global order exhibits a number of frailties. And these frailties are evident in the inability of the existing global order to resolve the major challenges of the day. We have seen how the United Nations has not allowed any substantive reforms since it was set up. You are all aware that in 1945, when the United Nations was set up, by the end of the year, there were 51 members. 51 members founded the United Nations. Actually, 50 signed the charter, and one came on later that year. So by the end of 1945, there were 51 members. The Republic of China was made a permanent member of the Security Council as the sole representative from Asia, simply because it was on the winning side of the World War II. That is to say, the victors granted that special status to the Republic of China, which is synonymous today with Taiwan, as in the former so-called Republic of China. We have seen how in 1962, after much debate and discourse, for the very first time, the non-permanent membership of the Security Council was expanded from 6 to 10, taking the entire membership up from 11 to 15. But there was no change in the permanent category and no discourse or discussion on the veto power. We have seen how since 1965, when that fateful decision took place, there has been no further change, absolutely. And the privileged five, in the case of the Republic of China, since replaced by the People's Republic in 1971, we have seen how permanent members have routinely used their privileged veto to promote their own interest and to thwart the emergence of a global consensus for the global good. We have seen how today the United Nations has 193 members, and a country like India, which is today the world's most populous country, which meets all the parameters required for entry into the Security Council in terms of its demography, in terms of its participation in peacekeeping operations, in terms of it having emerged as the fastest growing large economy in the world, growing at 7%, it is still, despite its advocacy of the values of peace and non-violence, it is still outside the UN Security Council. So that is a major frailty, the kind of frailty which has prevented the world from taking a common view of not just the pandemic, but also the war in Ukraine. We have seen how the global financial institutions, the multilateral development banks, have also failed to keep pace with the changing times. The World Bank and the IMF also represent the spoils of the war. They were set up as organizations, which are part of the UN complex that was set up in 1945. We cannot call an institution open and transparent if any change in the World Bank architecture requires US Congress's approval. It is therefore not an open architecture at all. It is still governed by the privileged Western countries, and change is impossible. Any kind of change without national interests being met somewhere else in the world. In the case of the IMF, we have seen how difficult it has been to tinker with the special drawing rights, for instance. I am a novice to this field of economics, but I read that the logic behind the SDRs was to give a country certain special drawing rights which are commensurate with the contribution of that country's economy, its relative weightage in the global economy, that is to say, global GDP. If we go by that logic, even taking into account that there is a certain common base provided by basic voting rights, we see that India, with its GDP contribution to the global economy in excess of around 3.4% or 3.5%, has SDRs only amounting to 2.75%. That long after it has overtaken the UK economy as the 5th largest economy in the world, its SDRs are much lower than that of the United Kingdom. And we have to keep in mind that no change is possible in the IMF without 85% of, the voting taking place as a consensus. You need a majority of 85%. Now, if one country, the United States of America, has 17.5% voting rights, you are never going to get that consensus unless a privileged country comes on board. So that is the situation, ladies and gentlemen. The IMF altogether holds, finances only to the tune of $1 trillion, which is only 1% of, the global GDP. And in a time when 75 countries of the world are distressed, many countries are unable to pay their debts, especially because of not just the pandemic and the ravages of the pandemic, but also because of the difficulties unleashed by the war in Ukraine in terms of disruptions, in terms of food, fuel, finance, fertilizers, that at this point of time also, the global community in the IMF, the privileged few who decide the, quantums to be allocated to others, have not been able to expand or, broaden the lending mechanisms there. We see that despite having only roughly 40%, of the special drawing rights, the developed countries control more than 60% of the finances. So this is something that also calls for rapid change. It calls for, beseeching and convincing the global financial institutions to open themselves up to more reform and also to create hybrid mechanisms, bringing in public-private partnerships, bringing in new forms of, finance from around the world to address the great challenges before us, including that of climate finance. When we look at the climate change question, we see once again that the world is reeling under the challenge not only of global warming, but also this great task of dealing with, what we call both mitigation and adaptation. If the focus is only on mitigation, on asking countries not to use fossil fuels, not to do X, Y, Z, not to use coal, to keep their emissions down, it does not address the fundamental problem of adaptation. If the world has to move forward towards, net zero, whether by 2050 or 2060 or 2070, the developing countries who are also on the cusp of a breakout in terms of their growth and development, finally, they will not have the finances to make the necessary adaptations to what we call green technologies. So transition is very important. To provide the kind of financing for that transition is something that is a great challenge today. And the broad estimates are that roughly $4 to $5 trillion are required annually to make that green transition for climate change challenge. So we are looking at a a very, very difficult period. And in this broad global enterprise as it exists today, we see that India has assumed the presidency of the G20. It is a rotational presidency, no doubt, but it comes at a very important juncture, both in the life of India as well as in the context of the global situation today. It is therefore a very, very important G20 presidency where for the first time 4 developing countries successively are holding the G20 presidency. The G20, as you all know, came up in 1999 following the Asian financial crisis, and the finance ministers and central bank governors engaged in a series of dialogues to see how to ameliorate the situation. And in 2008, the G20 also evolved into an apex level, summit level dialogue at the level of heads of state and government. And since then, it has been able to address some of the big economic challenges of our times, particularly in the aftermath of the 2 global financial and economic crises of 2007 and 2008. It is therefore to be hoped that the G20 can once again reinvent itself and provide that platform to a divided world outside of the UN, outside of the Security Council, which has only a few privileged people making decisions there, to provide a more broad-based, inclusive architecture in which the developed world and the developing world are both represented. After all, the G20 includes the G7. After all, the G20 includes the BRICS countries also. It includes developed as well as developing countries. It is by far the most representative grouping and capable of taking decisions based on consensus, going after low-hanging fruit. Even for the countries involved in major power contestation, the G20 should appear to be a great opportunity to step away from the, what we call the stasis on the highways of international and global decision-making and cooperation. Think of it as a wayside station where you can pull aside from a traffic jam, stretch your legs, have a coffee, sit for a while forgetting what's locked up, gridlocked on the highway, and trying to go in for decision-making, low-hanging fruit to address the big challenges of our time, whether it is macroeconomic recovery, whether it is making available what you call digital public infrastructure to everyone around us, whether it is the great challenge of meeting the Sustainable Development Goals of 2030, which have been declared very important by the United Nations in 2015. We are at the halfway mark, and there is no guarantee that we will be able to achieve these goals. How to go about the green transitions with regard to climate change. How to go about, for instance, the problem of multilateral reform, especially, as I said earlier, reform of the global institutions like the United Nations, multilateral development banks, and the international financial institutions. So these are the large issues today before the G20. And India's made every effort, again on the principle of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, not to leave anyone behind. India, as the Prime Minister has said, is determined to make it a very, very ambitious, decisive, and result-oriented G20. But it is also going to be different from other G20 summits, because this is a G20 summit in which India is also positioning itself as an option to the rest of the world, to a divided world in which there are binary options today, whether to take finances from the Bretton Woods architecture, which are not quite freely dispensing their finances, which have intrusive policies with regard to governance, human rights, etc., whether to take finances from the alternative, which may be like jumping out of the frying pan into the fire, that is to take, China's finances and end up in debt. India is the one that offers the third option today. This third option is made possible because India has emerged over the last few years as a vibrant economy, as a country whose voices heard on the global stage, a country that is no longer a bystander, no longer simply happy to be an observer, but is a country that is actively shaping outcomes. This is a country, therefore, that can provide this kind of third alternative and option to the rest of the world. To me, it is not just an option that is available in the realm of the material world. India is a country with its civilizational ethos, its history of peace and non-violence, of assimilation and integration. We can, as we did during the pandemic with our vaccine Maitri programs, we can, during this current period of challenge, also offer a dose of morality to the rest of the world. The world today needs a new moral compass, a new direction. And India is that country which can provide that moral compass also to the rest of the world. I think one of the finest examples of that moral compass is to be found in Prime Minister's proposal for lifestyle for the environment. It is basically a very moral idea that in an era in which climate change has become such an important topic, it is not an issue that can be easily resolved by fractious groupings around the world who are not agreed on what kind of financing to provide. That change must come from each one of us, from within. I'm so happy to note from my visit around the campus today that Prime Minister's lifestyle for environment is actually in action over here. Sustainable consumption, responsible consumption, to also have nature, tradition and modernity coexist. That bit about the Gurukul that I mentioned, it is lifestyle for environment. You are also creating here a generation of pro-planet people by infusing in them the values that India is well known for. So this is the context in which I wanted to convey a few thoughts. I had brought some points, but I have gone on to speak to you rather in an extempore manner, and I'm afraid of looking at any notes now, lest I confuse myself. So let me simply end at this note to say that I'm very optimistic about how India will occupy its rightful place in the current era as one of the leading nations of the world, one in which our 1.4 billion people will make truly remarkable contributions, not only for national development, but also for the good of mankind, humankind all around the world, with so much emphasis on gender equality, so much emphasis on integrating within our ambitions and aspirations the hopes and expectations of the global south. This is all evident in the fact that during our G20 summit, we will be inviting a large number of other non-G20 countries, especially from the global south, including from the Indian Ocean region, from Africa, from our neighborhood. We have also seen how India today is well poised to make great contributions in terms of not just economic development, but also in terms of peace and security. Without peace and security, there can be no economic development. And India, therefore, also believes in contributing actively to peace and security in our region, which is how the concept of the Indo-Pacific has evolved into being so fundamentally important to the 21st century. The Asia-Pacific had its own place in the latter half of the 20th century. It is no longer relevant. It has outlived its shelf life because today that growth and prosperity which was once restricted to one part of Asia, particularly East Asia, is today spreading like a prairie fire, like a wildfire across the region. There are countries, and we have every right to believe that we also wish to grow and that we have a right to grow. There are countries like the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Bangladesh, India, all the way up to the dynamic east coast of Africa. We see that great ferment, that sort of hope and expectation for a better life. And therefore, India is bound to play a very important role in bringing about peace and security in the Indo-Pacific, in which economic growth and prosperity is available to all humankind. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your patience.
After After such a wonderful presentation from our students and talks by our dignitaries, there must be many questions which you might be thinking of to ask them. So I'm just opening the round for questions. Anyone who want to ask a question, please raise their hands and they will be given the mic. They can ask the question from there on.
So the first question is, what steps are being taken up by the government of India to achieve goal number 17 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals? It states about partnership of goals. Yes. So any of the panelists can, because it's something which was talked by all of you. So if anyone can. Yes, sir.
So firstly, let me congratulate the young people who made excellent presentations, including the young scholar who has come from my own institute, Anandita Bhada. But I particularly want to congratulate all the Indian and foreign students who made presentations. You know, this is something that should be placed on record. My view is that goal number 17, requires basically the world to work together. This cannot happen unless there is a mindset change. Unless we can transcend borders, unless we can transcend national identities which are narrowly defined. And I'm reminded of this Sanskrit saying, I hope I get it right. Yatha heken chakren na rathasya gatir bhavat evam bina evam purush karen vina daivam na siddhyate. So just as a chariot cannot move on one wheel, so also without effort and due diligence we cannot achieve any goals. So it requires us to work together. The problem today at the international level is how to create that consensus. Not just between human beings, not just between countries, but also between institutions. Between what is now in jargon being called parallel institutions also. I'll give you one example. Take, for example, the Bretton Woods institutions that people have spoken about. These today are one of the options of the two, what I refer to as binary options. The parallel institutions are being created elsewhere. For instance, China, very much a part of the existing global order, is also creating some parallel institutions. Parallel institutions have been created by other countries also. Japan created the ADB. It is dominating the ADB. China has created the AIIB, the BRICS New Development Bank. Then China is dominating these institutions. How do you get the existing structures and the new structures also to cooperate? Now in the AIIB, which is a parallel institution led by China, China being the biggest dominating country there. I was a while ago, I seem to be complaining about the fact that in the IMF, the United States has 17.5% or some such share, which is clearly placing the US in a privileged position to stymie any kind of consensus, because you need 85%. And so the remaining 15% is actually less than what the US has. But then China dominates the AIIB. Japan dominates the ADB. India is very much a founding member of the AIIB. So is the United Kingdom. So is Australia. So is France. So is Germany. But there are countries like the United States of America and Japan that are not part of the AIIB. Dialogue partners are actually very much part of the AIIB. But there are some that are not. How do we get these conversations going? The idea is not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The idea is not to condemn multilateralism. Even weakened multilateralism is better than having no multilateralism. So what we have to do is really to preserve multilateralism, but to try and also reform it at its core. There is talk about reinvigorating multilateralism. For me, reinvigoration is not enough. You require to reform it also and make something of a habit of cooperation between, what we call the established privileged powers, the emerging economies and powers. Similarly, between competing, structures and institutions. But I'm sure some of our youngsters will also have something more to say.
Good afternoon, sir. I have one more question, which is, how can the G20 task force better engage and involve stakeholders from different sectors, which also includes civil society and also private sector? If anyone has an answer, they can answer this question if they want to.
Absolutely, sir. I mean, if you
So how can the G20 task force better engage and involve stakeholders from different sectors, which also includes civil society and private sector?
Devraj Pradhan has given a very good and precise answer. Let me just add to this that under India's G20 presidency, we have the largest number of engagement groups ever. We have 11 engagement groups, and this straddles the entire spectrum of what you call civil society, NGOs, the business world. That is why you have, for instance, the B20, which is in fact led by the MD of Tata Group, Mr. Chandrasekharan, or Civil 20, which is led by Ma Amritanandamayi in Amritapuri in Kollam in Kerala. You have the Youth 20, you have the W20. When you look at this spectrum, including, for instance, the Think 20, which is the Ideas Bank, you will see that we are engaging just about everybody. So the engagement groups will give you the answer to your question. When you look at the engagement groups under India's presidency and the kind of topics that they deal with, the spectrum of interests that they have included. Thank you.
Sir, as we know, terrorism is big problem and big obstacle for development. Then what will be the step taken by Indian leadership in G20 to reduce terrorism?
That's okay. It doesn't look good. Look, for India, terrorism is in fact front and center. And so every conceivable opportunity is used to flag the challenge of terrorism. And if you look at the statements that come out at the level of the foreign ministers, etc., you will find a reference somewhere again to terrorism also. But it's difficult to get the G20 in its entirety to agree, seamlessly on any particular definition of terrorism, because the definition of terrorism has actually eluded consensus at the global level also. At the United Nations, for instance, for long there has been a demand by countries like India that we should have an international convention against terrorism. But the definitional aspects of terrorism, in terms of good terrorists, bad terrorists, people that harbor terrorists, define them differently, give them different labels, this makes it very difficult. But there is growing consensus at the plurilateral level within the G20 on these critical issues. So if we cannot do things at the G20 level, it does not still prevent us from seeking what we call near consensus with other like-minded partners within the G20. Notably, there would be a greater convergence on terrorism between India and the G7, no doubt, because the G7 also has a similar perception of terrorism. India can also use Japan's presidency of the G7 to achieve this kind of an objective, because India and Japan in their bilateral statements have always agreed on the common threat of terrorism. If you read the bilateral statements of summits. So there is already an agreement between India and Japan. And since we are respective chairs, there is ground here to work together. But there may be others that may not be able to see terrorism exactly the same way, because people belong to different groups. If there are, for instance, OIC members, which are within the G20, and there are OIC members, they're bound to look at it differently because of their own constituencies and such things. But we must keep up the pressure.
I'm a student from Mass Communication. My question is short, but it is for everyone. So as emphasized on, climate change has been a great problem, but don't you think there are bigger problems to address first, like eradication of poverty, food and improvement of living conditions in third world countries? Because this seems to fulfill the purpose of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam.
No, I think the short answer is that all these are important. This is not supposed to be either or. You cannot be talking only of, poverty and, eradication of poverty and not talking of climate change. Nor can you simply talk of climate change and not talk of the other. Because these are also intrinsically interlinked today. Today, you are aware that climate change can actually exacerbate the problem of poverty by creating, food shortages, by creating natural disasters, by displacing people, by creating, internally displaced persons, by forcing migration across borders. Climate change can cause all of the above. When entire water systems dry up, when there are either floods or famines, what happens is catastrophic in terms of its impact. So I think these have to proceed simultaneously. Thank you.